Well, thanks, Julio, and I'll give a totally ideological rant against, no, I won't be entirely against Donald Trump. I will have some positive things to say, I promise. They won't all be positive, I'll also promise that, though. So anyhow, well, I appreciate people taking time to listen, and also I'm glad to hear, I know Randall Ray, so he's a very good person. If you can get here tomorrow morning, it's certainly worth your time to come and hear him talk. So, okay, so basic story I want to talk about. These are, I was trying to decide because Trump obviously, he has an ambitious agenda. I think that's fair to say. So I'm going to focus on these 5 areas. I could have talked about many, many others, but I think it's fair to say these are the 5 biggest areas, or certainly 5 big ones. We'll just put it that way. Taxes, he had his big tax cut. You know, again, if we had Donald Trump sitting here, I think he'd agree that's important. That was a big deal. So he got his $1.5 trillion tax cut passed at the end of last year. So I'll say a bit about that. Monetary policy, this is something that a lot of people don't pay attention to, and I think it's a big mistake. So I'm going to talk about that. I think it's very, very important. It has been getting more attention. I'll say a little bit about when I get to that. But you know, people think of a Federal Reserve Board that's this mysterious body. Unfortunately, it is kind of mysterious. It's not as mysterious as people think. But it's a weird, weird body because it's partly private, partly public. They do a lot of things in secret. It's kind of weird that way. But the key thing I'm going to point out here is that Donald Trump basically has a chance to rebuild the Fed. You have 7 governors that are appointed by the president, approved by Congress. They sit for 14 years. Only one of those is a holdover from Obama. Okay, he reappointed Jay Powell, but that was his choice to reappoint Jay Powell, okay, the Fed chair. So that has a huge impact on the economy. Third, trade and tariffs. This has, again, obviously been front and center. This is the sort of thing, I think I sent Julio the slides last week. I was waiting. You know, I tend not to put things off till the last minute. I probably should have put it off longer, though, because, you know, this is ongoing story. You know, who knows where that will end up, but it's a big deal. Healthcare, the Trump administration has made it a priority to get rid of Obamacare. They are attacking in various ways. It's still there, though. It's still there. And regulation, again, quite explicitly, Trump has said he wants to make it more business friendly. So it's not, I mean, you can decide whether it's a good thing or bad thing, but if he were sitting here, I think he would agree. He wants it to be more business friendly. Okay, so starting with the tax cuts, gets $1.5 trillion in tax cuts. That's over a 10-year period. Now, people have, you know, a lot of my friends have jumped on this huge, huge tax cut. It is a large tax cut, but in the scheme of things, it's not that large in the sense that $1.5 trillion, it's more money than I'll see, more money than probably anyone but Jeff Bezos will ever see. But, you know, okay, what does it come down to? $1.5 trillion a year. That's about 0.7%, 0.8% of GDP. It's a big chunk of change. It's not. We've had bigger tax cuts, I'll put it that way. George W. Bush had a bigger tax cut. Reagan had a bigger tax cut. Trump likes to say it was the biggest tax cut ever. It actually wasn't, but whatever. I don't care. He could believe that if he wants. But you know, it's a big tax cut. It's not unprecedented. And again, part of that story goes with the deficits. Democrats have said it's going to create huge deficits. It definitely expands the deficit, okay? But we've had bigger deficits. You could decide whether you think they're too big, too small. But it's not going to be this disaster that suddenly no one's going to hold U.S. government bonds because of this huge tax cut. That part isn't true. Okay, so what's the main part of the story? This main part of the story was a cut in the corporate income tax rate. He lowered the corporate income tax rate from 35% to 21%. And the question is, who's going to benefit from that? Now, most immediately, the benefits go to shareholders, and I don't think it's a controversial issue. I mean, this has been, again, something been in the news that, you know, the Trump administration has wanted to tout that a number of firms have announced bonuses that they're giving to their workers, or in some cases pay raises or 401ks. That's all good, but there's no doubt about it. The vast, vast majority of the tax cut is going to shareholders, either in the form of higher dividends, share buybacks, or the firms are holding on to the money. Okay, but the ratio, if you look, and I had occasion to look at some of these because I was curious. I wrote a couple posts on these. If you look, take Verizon. They announced that they were giving $1,000 bonuses to each of their workers. And you do the arithmetic on it. They had 200,000 workers. It's $200 million. Okay, decent chunk of change. One-time bonuses, $200 million. Okay, on the other hand, if you looked at their financial statements, their tax cut saves them around $2 billion a year. Okay, so they gave, as a one-time bonus, an amount equal to 10% of their annual savings. Okay, so that pretty much is, insofar as you've had other companies that announce bonuses, that's more or less what you see. Okay, a few have been more generous, but for the most part, what you see is whatever they've announced by way of bonuses, that's a tiny fraction of what they're getting in terms of the tax cut. So I don't think that should really be a controversial position, that most of the benefits go to shareholders. Now, if I had their people, and we were talking earlier, his chief economist, this guy Kevin Hassett, who's a conservative economist, I know him a bit, I actually wrote a couple things with him. He's a true believer on this. So if we had Kevin Hassett here, he'd go, we don't care about that, because what's going to happen is there's going to be this big flood of investment. That's going to increase productivity growth. And if we have higher productivity growth, wages will grow along with productivity. So his projections were 10 years out, people will on average have about 10% higher wages. Okay. Now, if that story were true, that would actually be a pretty good story. So in other words, if you envision someone working for $40,000 a year, 20 bucks an hour pay, not terribly high pay, they get another $4,000 a year. And that's each year. That'd be a pretty good story. Okay. Now, what I'd say is that, one, the evidence that he's citing, and he's done some of that work, is not very strong. But the other point I'd say is that if we believe that, if we believe there's going to be a flood of investment, we actually have some basis for assessing that at this point. So we could take a look. I'll just jump ahead with my next slide. I'll come back. If we look at capital goods orders, this goes back to the pre-recession period. Very hard to see that jump. Now, if you think I'm being unfair, because we only have 2 months, we only have January and February, keep in mind what Kevin Hassett's story, chief economist's story is. He's saying that when they see this lower tax rate, they're all going to go, hey, we all want to invest. Now, tax bill just gets signed. It's passed by Congress in December, signed, I forget the exact day, but towards the end of the month. They began talking about this tax bill back in September. Okay, so they knew the general outlines of the tax bill. It was certain it was going to pass when the Senate passed it in, I forget, just before Christmas. It was certain it was going to be signed into law. Trump waited a week or something to sign it into law. If you believe that they hugely respond to tax rates, so in other words, you lower the tax rate, they're going to run out there and invest, they should have been thinking back in September, hey, this thing is coming down the pike. What do we want to do? I mean, think of Google, think of General Electric, think of big companies. If they're hugely responsive to the tax rate, they're paying attention to what's going on in Washington. So they're saying, hey, what's on our list? What will we do if they give us this tax cut that we wouldn't otherwise do? So come January, come February, these are orders. So we're not asking, do they have the machinery up in place? Have they built the factory? That'd be silly. Obviously, that takes time. We're just asking, have they gotten on the phone? Or have they clicked in an order on the internet? That doesn't take months. Okay, so we're not seeing that. We're not seeing much evidence. There's a little up, a little down. We're not seeing much evidence in January and February of any sort of big uptick in investment, or orders, I should say, that is what you would expect if, in fact, the tax cut led to a huge surge in investment. Okay, so we do have, at least some preliminary evidence that we're not going to see the spur of investment. And I'll grant, it's early. Maybe, if I'm giving this talk a year from now, you could all laugh at me, but I don't think so. But that's what their claim would be. Okay, the individual tax cuts, again, this is overwhelmingly going to the wealthy. There's some things there for lower, more moderate income people, but the vast majority goes to the wealthy. One of the things that was kind of incredible, it doubles the child tax credit from $1,000 to $2,000 per child up to 2 kids. But what the big change in here was that they raised the point at which you could get the limit. So there was an income cutoff before. I think it was about $120,000. It began to phase out. I won't sort of that exact number. But what that meant was, if you're a high earner, if you earn $200,000, you weren't benefiting from it. If you earn $200,000 a year, you could probably pay for your own kids. So that was the idea with the way it was structured before. So now they double it from $1,000 to $2,000, and you can get it up to $500,000. That's for a couple, just to be clear. So that's a 2-earner couple, $500,000 limit. So you have a lot of people that maybe aren't the richest in the world, but if you're earning $400,000, you probably don't need an extra $2,000 per kid from the government. On the other hand, it's not refundable. Okay, so what that meant is, say you have a single mother earning $15,000, she basically got nothing. Okay, because she wasn't paying income taxes to begin with, so she basically got nothing. So the people who you might envision needed it most, people earning $15,000, $20,000, they got little or nothing from this child tax credit. People are higher up, earning say $150,000, $200,000, $250,000, they got a lot out of it. If they had 2 kids, they got $4,000 from that. They lowered the top tax rate from 39.6% to 37%. That makes 2.6 percentage points might not sound like that much. Suppose you earn $2 million a year. Well, we just handed you over $50,000. Okay, so that's a good chunk of change. Creates 20% reduction for income from pass-through corporations. Okay, I won't go in great detail on this, but this is an accountant's dream. Okay, because a pass-through corporation is a corporation that doesn't pay taxes. Okay, a lot of people are misled on this. They said they wanted to treat pass-through corporations like other corporations. No, pass-through corporations don't pay taxes. This is the tax on income that individuals get from a pass-through corporation. Okay, well, pass-through corporations are really easy to create. So what you just did was you told every high-earning doctor, lawyer, professional, someone who's earning $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, if you could create a pass-through corporation and arrange for much of your income to come through that corporation, you get 20% off on your taxes. What are they going to do? They're going to create pass-through corporations. Okay, and I know a number of economists across the political spectrum. They just said, if you said, what was the worst thing about the bill? They said that. Just because it's one of these things that, we could argue whether it's good to have corporations pay a higher or lower tax. Point's arguable. I mean, I'd rather have them pay a higher tax. It's at least an arguable point. There's obviously some benefit if they're taxed less. This is a way to create jobs for accountants that do nothing for the economy. Okay, it makes no sense. Okay, so that's a seriously bad thing. The last thing I have on my list, cap state and local tax deductions. You're in New York. Maybe most of you aren't in this income bracket, but a lot of people here are because it's a relatively wealthy state, relatively high tax state. And what they did was they said you could only write off $10,000 of state and local taxes against your federal taxes. Okay, well, in New York, you have a lot of people, even someone who's fairly middle income, they could pay $10,000 in property taxes. You could have a middle income person. I mean, I know it sounds expensive, but I have friends, their parents bought houses 30 years ago, middle income houses. Today, they sell for over $1 million. So you could have someone who has over $10,000 in tax liability just on their property taxes from what at least used to be a middle income house. I'm not going to say buy a $1 million house that's middle income today, but they bought it 20, 30 years ago when it was. Okay, what that means is you can't take the deduction at all on your state taxes. And New York has relatively high state income taxes. Okay, well, this was quite explicitly designed as a way to hit states like New York. And I'm not reading people's minds. They said that. Okay, so you had a number of Republican members of Congress, Republican advisors who said, well, if New York State wants to have, pay more for education, more for health care, well, then they're going to have to pay for it. The federal government isn't going to subsidize it. So the way it stands now, if the federal government's taxing me, say I'm a high-income person, and they're taxing me, they raise my taxes by another $10,000. In the old way, when you had this be deductible, the government was in effect picking up 40 cents on the dollar. So they just taxed me $10,000. Federal government handed me $4,000 back, so they taxed me $6,000, not $10,000. So that made it easier for a state like New York, a state like California, to have higher taxes on high-income people. Well, if you cap it at $10,000, it becomes much harder. Okay, and as some of you may know, your governor pushed through I had something to do with this, but your governor pushed through some measures that basically restored the deductibility. I think that was a good thing to do. Okay, my capital good orders. Now, I will say some positive things. I told you I'd say some good things about Trump, so I have my list of positives. One is doubling the standard deduction from $6,000. It was a little more than $6,000. I think it was $62,63 to $12,000. That was a really good thing to do. So what this means is they're getting rid of the personal exemption. So currently a personal exemption, or back last year, the personal exemption, I think it was $5,400. Get rid of that. And they say, okay, here's the standard deduction, $12. $12,000 per person. It's not 12, I'm sorry. $12,000 per person. So what it's saying is that I have a very strong incentive simply to take the standard deduction. Okay, so a lot of people who previously itemized are going to take the standard deduction. If you have a couple that get a $24,000 standard deduction, you have to have a lot of itemized deductions to be above $24,000. Okay, I mentioned they capped the state and local income tax deduction. You'd have to have a lot of deductions to get over $24,000. So what that means, and people have looked at this, somewhere around 90% of people they now expect will take the standard deduction. Why is that a good thing? people don't want to waste time on their tax returns. I don't know anyone wants to waste time. You know, people get scared of it. You know, they're worried they're going to do something wrong and the IRS will come and arrest them or something. You know, I don't like doing it. I'm an economist. I'm used to dealing with numbers and forms, you know, so it's not that big a deal for me. But most people aren't. So, you know, they pay H&R Block $200, $300. You know, it's a lot of money to throw in the garbage, you know. So if you could just, you know, take the thing and go, oh, I'm taking the standard deduction, take 20 minutes, look it over, and send it in, that's a great thing. Now, I have my Part B. They could have IRS prepare tax returns. What do I mean by this? Well, at least in many, if not most European countries, the tax agency does your returns for you. Okay, so what they do is, you know, they have the information. Most people get pretty much all their money from their wages. They have that information. So they just say, if you're taking a standard deduction, they just say, okay, you made $45,000, 2 kids, blah, blah, blah. Here's what you owe, or here's what we owe you. They send it to you. And if you think it's wrong, you get, I don't know, 30 days or something, and you file an appeal. You show them the forms. You go, no, you know, you took out $1,000 too much. You owe me another $1,000. But for most people, they look at it and they go, fine, end of story. Love to see them do that. They don't do that in the United States because H&R Block is a very powerful lobby. Okay, we aren't that much technologically behind, you know, Germany and France and other countries where they do that, you know. So, you know, but having more people itemized is a good step in the right direction. Maybe somewhere down the road, we'll actually be able to have the IRS prepare the returns like other countries. Limit the mortgage interest deduction. They didn't limit it that much, but what they did was you can't take a deduction on more than on a mortgage of more than $750,000. Now, I've had arguments with a lot of reporters because they go, oh, well, you know, in New York, a lot of homes cost $8, $9 million. I go, that's fine, but what's your mortgage on that home? Okay, so let's say you got an 80% mortgage. You know, you put down 20%. That's kind of standard. I know people often put down less, but let's say you put down 80% on $1 million home. Well, your mortgage is $800,000. Okay, so you're able to deduct your interest on $750,000. It's only the interest on the difference, the $50,000 difference between $800,000 and $750,000. You can't deduct from your taxes. That doesn't seem like that big a deal. Now, if I had a $2 million home, okay, that's more, but actually, we already had a cap of $1 million. So they lowered it from $1 million to $750,000. I thought that was a good thing, you know, and I wish they'd actually lowered it more because basically the mortgage interest deduction is subsidizing higher income people. I mean, it's fair to say no poor person gets an $800,000 home. So it's subsidizing higher income people, not necessarily the richest, but higher income people to get more expensive houses. Why do we want to do that? Okay, I could understand subsidizing it, make it easier for low, moderate income people to buy homes, but a lot of those people are taking the standard deduction. They don't get anything from this. Okay, so that was something I thought was a really good thing. So again, I promise you I'd have some good things to say about the Trump administration or Trumponomics. That was a very good thing. Another thing they did, they limited the corporate interest deduction. Okay, this is a shot at private equity. I assume folks are familiar with private equity companies. Mitt Romney brought them to fame in 2012. Is very rich from being in private equity, and other people are much richer than him in private equity. One of the standard things that private equity does is they buy up a company and then they leverage it, they borrow to the hilt against it. People are familiar with the Toys R Us bankruptcy. You know, it was what, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, they're shutting down. I don't know where they stand in that, but in any case, they announced they're shutting down. And what happened with Toys R Us was it's taken over private equity companies. They basically borrowed every cent they could against the company. And the reason why this makes sense for private equity companies, they could deduct the interest on their loans. Okay, so they end up with the situation they're able to deduct the interest, encourage them to borrow to the hilt. If they were able to turn around Toys R Us and then sell it again as a public company, they'd have made a fortune. As it was, they borrowed so much, that goes to the private equity company. They issued bonds, the loans go to the money from the loans went to the private equity company, not to Toys R Us. And then as it turns out, they end up going bankrupt. Well, that ends up being often a very profitable deal, in large part because they're able to deduct the interest. So what they did was they said in the tax bill, you can't deduct more than 30% of your profits. Okay, you can only deduct interest up to 30% of your profits. There is one exception to that. Anyone know which industries accepted to that? I'll give you a hint. What industries are president in? Real estate, yeah. So real estate's accepted from that. So, but in any case, that was a good thing to do. The last thing on my list, they capped the deduction for CEO pay at $500,000. Now, some people have pushed this policy for a long time. So what this means is, you have a CEO, and it's common for CEOs to get pay of 10, 15, 20 million a year. What this is saying is that you could only deduct the first 500,000 against your taxes. The rest is treated as profits. So if you're paying your CEO 20 million a year, you only get to say 500,000 that was a business expense. The other 19.5 million, that's your profits. You're going to pay tax on that. Okay, now a lot of people propose that as being a good thing to do because of lower CEO pay. I've always been skeptical of that, and I just did a paper with Jessica Scheider at the Economic Policy Institute where we looked at what happened after the Affordable Care Act was passed. The Affordable Care Act limited the deduction for health insurers, just health insurers. So it limited the deduction for CEO pay for the health insurance industry at $500,000. So we looked, did that have an impact? And we didn't know. Turned out it didn't. We looked at the data, we beat it up every way it could to see if there was any way we were missing it, and it turned out it had no impact on CEO pay in the health insurance industry. So, I mean, in other words, we're trying to control because, we know the Affordable Care Act meant they had more revenue, more profits. We controlled for those things, and when you control for those things, there was no impact at all. So I don't think this will reduce their pay. It's a small increase in corporate income taxes, and I'm inclined to think that's a good thing. So that's my reason for having it on my good list. But I don't expect it to lower CEO pay. Okay, Federal Reserve. As I said, the Federal Reserve Board is hugely important, and it doesn't get anywhere near as much attention as it should. The Federal Reserve Board, I trust people at least are familiar with the Federal Reserve Board. We had Alan Greenspan there all the time. Ben Bernanke was put in there by Bush, reappointed by Obama, then was replaced by Janet Yellen, first female Fed chair. And Janet Yellen's term ended in February or January. I forget exactly where it ended, the end of January, first day of February. Ended in any case at that time. And Trump had the opportunity either to reappoint or appoint someone different. So he decided to go with Jerome Powell, who was already on the board, but he wasn't chair, so Trump made her Fed chair. Okay, well, the reason why this is so important is the Fed, with their interest rate policy, basically is deciding how fast they want the economy to grow. Now, the Fed can't necessarily make it grow faster. So what happened during the downturn, we had the fiscal stimulus under President Obama. Wasn't large enough. I think most people will acknowledge that. But the Fed said, okay, what can we do to make the economy grow faster? So they pushed the interest rate, the overnight interest rate that's under their control, the federal funds rate, they pushed that to zero. That was pretty much as low as it could go. So it goes to zero. And then they also bought up a pile of government bonds. There was a policy called quantitative easing, with the idea that they would lower long-term interest rates. So this is how they try to control the level of output in the economy. If you lower long-term interest rates, it's cheaper for me to buy a house because mortgages are cheaper. It's cheaper for me to borrow my credit card. Businesses that might want to expand, it's cheaper for them to borrow. State and local governments, they might want to have a bond issue to finance infrastructure. It's cheaper for them. So this has a number of effects in terms of increasing demand in the economy. Okay, now, again, they can't always increase demand as much as they would have liked in 2009, 2010. If you talk to anyone in the Fed, I'm sure they would have said, we wish we could have done more. They would have wanted to boost the economy more. But now they're going the other way. They've been raising rates ever since December of 2016. And the reason they're doing that is they're worried the economy is going to grow too fast. Okay, so they look at things like the unemployment rate. They see that we have an unemployment rate of 4.1%. Historically, that's a relatively low unemployment rate. So what you have is people at the Federal Reserve Board saying, well, if the unemployment rate keeps going down, and many of them think 4.1 is already too low, we're going to see wages start rising rapidly. That's going to lead to inflation. That would be a bad thing. So what's going on is they've been raising interest rates. They've raised them now 5 times, just a quarter point at a time. They've been raising interest rates gradually with the idea that they don't want the economy to grow too rapidly. They don't want the unemployment rate to get lower. Many of them, as I said, would have rather the unemployment rate didn't get below 5. So in fact, you had some who didn't want it to get below 6. But that's the big issue. So it sounds strange to people that you have an agency of the government that's keeping people from getting jobs. But that's in fact what they're doing. And again, they would justify that. I mean, they wouldn't probably want to use those terms. But they would say, we don't want it to overheat. We don't want to have inflation. If you go back to the 70s, we got double-digit inflation. So, we could all agree we don't want that. So they say, well, we have to do this or we're going to have double-digit inflation. So that's how they would put that story. So the question is, okay, so who's he appointing to the Fed? Well, Jerome Powell was as I said, he was a governor. He was under Janet Yellen. There's a tradition. The Fed's a very, very strange body. It tends to be the case that the governors go along with the Fed chair. Okay, so Janet Yellen, whatever she wanted to do, Jerome Powell did. So he always voted along with her. Now, you also have 12 bank presidents, regional bank presidents. New York is just turning over their bank president, just appointed a new person. You have 12 bank presidents around the region. Those people are appointed largely by the banks in the region. Okay, those people also have a vote on monetary policy. So they also decide interest rate policy, not directly under President Trump's control. President Trump gets to appoint 7 members of the Board of Governors. You have one holdover. Yellen just left. You have one holdover from Obama, Lyle Brainerd. Powell was a holdover. He didn't have to be Fed chair, but he would have stayed as a governor had he not been Fed chair. So he's sort of a holdover, but he's made Fed chair. And then you had 5 open seats. Okay, now he's filled one of them with a moderate person. It's not clear which way he'll go. He appointed this person, Marvin Goodfriend, who's an economist. I'm forgetting now where he's an economist at. I'm forgetting, it's slipping my mind where he's an economist at. But he's a very conservative economist in the sense that he wanted high interest rates. He's very, very concerned about inflation. So that's the reference to him being a hawk. He wanted to raise interest rates. So you can go back to 2010, 2011, when we still had 8 or 9% unemployment. He was saying, well, we really can't do much better than this. The Fed should be raising interest rates or we'll have inflation. Now, whether he gets through the Senate or not isn't clear because the Democrats seem unanimous in opposing him, and one Republican, Rand Paul, is also opposed to him. So it's not clear that they'll have the votes to get him through. But you still have several other positions open. Richard Clarida, who's also an economist at I think it's Citigroup, who's more expansionary, in other words, in favor of lower interest rates. He's been privately, his name's been circulated. These are leaks, the way things work in Washington. The leaks from the administration. His name has been circulated as someone who's likely to be picked as vice chair. Okay, it's a very important position. So he's someone who's more moderate, more likely to be in favor of lower interest rates. Well, this is going to be a big issue because, again, even if Marvin Goodfriend gets it, if Clarida gets it, you still have 3 more positions. Okay, and whether he picks people that are in favor of high interest rates because they're concerned about inflation, rising wages, or he picks people who support lower interest rate who'd rather let the unemployment rate fall, that will be a very, very big issue going forward. So I don't have a clear answer on that. He's said things both ways. If you go by Trump's public statements, he sometimes praised Janet Yellen, said she did an outstanding job, said he likes low interest rates. Other times he was yelling about her debasing the currency and kind of, to my view, strange things. But so I don't know which way he'll go, but that will be a very big issue. Okay, trade. As I said, this seems to change by the day. There are a number of issues that you could have with trade policy. Just to back up for a second, we have a large trade deficit. So we have a trade deficit of around 3% of GDP, somewhere around $600 billion a year. How big a deal is that? Well, 2 things I'll say about it. On the one hand, it definitely drains demand from our economy. So if we have a trade deficit of $600 billion, that's $600 billion that people in the United States are spending in Europe, in Japan, in China. It's creating growth, creating jobs there rather than here. Now, does that matter? Well, during the recession, that almost certainly did matter, because if you go back 5 years ago when we would have liked more demand in the economy, the fact that we had a trade deficit was a problem. So that was draining demand on the economy. Today, I just was talking about the Fed. They're raising interest rates. Well, suppose we snapped our fingers, trade deficit 0. Well, probably those people at the Fed would be raising interest rates much more quickly, because they go, we have too much demand in the economy. Okay, so it's not clear. It doesn't matter what I think is too much demand. It's what they think. So it's not clear that if we had a smaller trade deficit today, we'd have much more demand in the economy, because the Fed might act to offset that. The other issue, though, is the composition of demand. So trade is overwhelmingly manufactured goods. I mean, people will say you have trade and services, and we do. But the vast majority, I haven't looked at the numbers lately, but I'm sure it's at least 80% of trade, might be as much as 90. It's manufactured goods. Okay, so this is steel, this is cars, car parts. So if you had a smaller trade deficit, you'd have more people employed in manufacturing. Now, even if we say had the trade deficit go down to 0, we still, and all these people point out it wasn't trade, it was productivity. That's partly true. Even if we had the trade deficit go down to 0, we wouldn't get back the jobs we've lost over the last 2 decades in manufacturing. Get back some of them. We might get back 1.5, 2 million, we won't get back 10 million. We currently have about 12 million people employed in manufacturing. If we got the trade deficit, I don't envision down to zero, no reason to get down to zero, but say knocked it down 2 percentage points of GDP, 380 billion, you'd probably create somewhere around 1.5, 2 million jobs in manufacturing. Historically, manufacturing's been a source of relatively good paying jobs for people without college degrees. So that probably helps the income distribution. Okay, so that's why I would say there's some significance to the trade deficit. But the idea that you'll hear President Trump say we're big losers because of the trade deficit, well, somewhat true, but I think could be misrepresented. Okay, so what has he done on this? Well, the first thing he did, he put tariffs on Chinese washing machines and solar panels. I'm forgetting whether this was December or January. It was either the end of last year or early this year. Now, that was actually the result of a complaint that was brought during the Obama administration. So they brought a complaint to the United States International Trade Commission. It was a nonpartisan body. I don't even think Trump's appointed anyone to it yet. I'd have to go back and check. But in any case, it's a nonpartisan body. And they review evidence. The claim is that China's subsidizing these two sectors, their exports of washing machines and solar panels. They ruled they were. And I haven't looked at it in great detail, but it seems like there's pretty good evidence for it that they're probably right, that they did have the subsidy. So they told Trump, you could put countervailing tariffs. That's what our law says. That's actually what the WTO allows. So it's not a violation of the WTO, if that's true. Okay, so that was very much within our rights as a member of the WTO. It didn't violate trade policy. Again, you could say it was bad policy, and that's an arguable point, but it was totally within the law, and it's something Obama may well have done. I don't know what he would have done, but he did do similar things during his presidency. So it wasn't anything unusual. On the other hand, he then said, okay, we're going to have these tariffs on steel and aluminum, totally different rationale. He said for national defense. Okay, now this is not consistent with the WTO, and it's frankly kind of strange, I'll just put it that way. Because originally he said he was going to put them on Canada and Mexico, which are both close allies and bordering the US. So it's hard to understand the national defense issue. I mean, we could understand, you could envision, although it takes a little bit of imagination, envision it's World War II again and we can't get steel, okay, because we imported it all from Japan and we're at war with Japan. I mean, okay, we all could understand that. But you're pretty hard-pressed to imagine the war where we need all this steel and we're getting a lot of it from Japan and Mexico. We can't get it from Japan. Are we at war with Japan and Canada and Mexico? I mean, so it was kind of strange. Then he said, okay, well, Canada and Mexico, we're not going to do it to them. And then he said, I think he said, although I'm not absolutely sure, that we aren't going to do it to the European Union. So he obviously is doing it with China, and I'm not sure who else. But it's not explicitly because they have subsidies. So again, he could bring a case, you could bring a case to the U.S. International Trade Commission and say, China's subsidizing their exports of steel and aluminum. And I think that's certainly true of steel and less sure of aluminum. You could bring that case. He didn't do that. Okay, so this is very likely a violation of the WTO rules. And go, okay, what does he hope to get out of that? And again, that's not entirely clear. He's yelling at countries that we have trade deficits with. Some of them, as I say, with China, there's a case that they subsidize them. There's also evidence, I'd say good evidence, that they've deliberately kept down the value of their currency. So you could say, okay, we want you to raise the value of your currency. He's not saying that, though. So he's saying we're mad at you because you have a trade surplus with us. So that's kind of strange. I mean, again, I could at least understand, you could argue whether it's good or bad policy, but I could at least understand, say, we're going to put tariffs on you because we want you to change this policy. He's not doing that. He's upset at them because we have a trade deficit with them. Now, maybe in private he is doing that, but at least in public he's not. So it makes it look very strange, and I personally only know what he does, what he and the administration say publicly. So that looks very strange. He ended the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is a treaty that actually was begun under the Bush administration, mostly negotiated in the Obama years. Involved 11 other countries, the Asian Pacific region. And it was finished during the Obama administration. He never actually submitted to Congress because he didn't have the votes. And Trump ran on this. He said he would can it. Hillary Clinton actually said the same thing. That wasn't originally her position because she'd been at the State Department when it was being negotiated. But during the primary, she was running against Bernie Sanders, who was very strongly opposed to it. So she adopted that position as well. Who knows what she would have done had she gotten in the White House. But in any case, Trump had made that a central theme of his campaign, and he pulled the U.S. out of the path. Now, he got a lot of grief from that. I actually was very sympathetic to that idea because the Trans-Pacific Partnership was not particularly about trade. I said there are 11 other countries in that. We already have trade deals with 6 of them. You know, Mexico's in there, Canada's in there, Australia's in there. We already have trade deals with them. So our trade barriers with them are already basically 0. So what was this about? Well, this was about a lot of commercial rules. One of the really big ones, intellectual property, patents and copyrights. Those, to my view, are really bad policies. We're trying to make patents and copyrights longer and stronger. That probably has the biggest impact in prescription drugs. That's not something I like to see. We make prescription drugs very expensive because of patents. You know, so almost in all cases, drugs are cheap to manufacture. So when you hear of a drug costing people tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands a year for some of the new cancer drugs, it's not because it costs them that to produce it. Okay, almost invariably, you can produce it for a few hundred, maybe $1,000. You know, it costs that much because this is a drug that we gave a company a patent monopoly on it. And if it's your life at stake and you have a way to get your insurer or the government to pay $300,000, you'll do it. Okay, that's a real backward policy to my view. So I was not disappointed to see the Trans-Pacific Partnership go down because that was a very big part of it. I should also point out there were a lot of restrictions on what countries would be able to do. Goes under the frame e-commerce, but it's really about things like what we're hearing now with Facebook, that if you want to regulate Facebook and say, okay, you can't give away people's data, that your ability to do that would be much more restricted under the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So I'm not upset about that going away. Okay, but that was something, again, whether those were Trump's concerns or not, I have no way of knowing, but that's part of what we lost when the Trans-Pacific Partnership, at least the US, is not a signatory. NAFTA, again, he's saying he's going to renegotiate NAFTA. It's not clear what his priorities are in renegotiating NAFTA, because again, he's put all sorts of things on the table. One thing I will say that I think is a very good thing, and I do know, because I know one of the people in his administration is at the center of this, they want to get rid of the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism. And people here know what this is, investor-state dispute. It sounds like a conspiracy theory. I thought it was a crazy conspiracy theory when I first heard about it, but I promise you, this actually exists. This is a mechanism that's open to foreign investors where they could say, we think you violated the treaty. And it doesn't go to, let's say we think, you know, we have Exxon or someone's investing in Mexico, and Mexico did something, they imposed a regulation that they said violates the treaty. So they take it to investor-state dispute settlement tribunal. Exxon gets to pick one person. Mexico's government picks one person. And then those two people jointly pick a third person. And they decide the case. Now, I've had big arguments with people, can't overrule Mexico's law. That's right, can't overrule Mexico's law. But what they could say is that Mexico's law, its regulation, is going to cost Mexico $2 billion a year for each year it's in place. Okay, so Mexico could leave the law in place, but they're going to have to pay $2 billion a year. And the question that I and others have is, why do you need something like that? Because Exxon could already bring a case in Mexico's courts, or in U.S. court if the other way around, it was a Canadian company. Why do you need something like this? It's kind of hard to see. Why do foreign investors need some special tribunal? They already have the courts, and certainly in the case of the United States, Canada, most of the countries we do most of our trade with, we have pretty well-established courts. We're putting this. We had a plan to put this in place in the European Trade Pact. I remember once talking to a reporter from Germany, and she's going, "You don't trust our courts?" I have no problem with your courts, but the implication is that somehow foreign investors can't count on a fair shake. Now, I'm sure there are some countries where that's true, but what I'd say is, one, most of the countries we do most of our trade with, that's not true. In other words, Europe, Japan, you can count on a fair deal. Even a lot of developing countries where we might say the legal system isn't 100% up to snuff, they don't want to screw foreign investors for the simple reason they want the foreign investment. Okay, so if, say Thailand, I'm sorry to pick on Thailand, I don't know anything about their legal system, but let's for the moment say that, they had the courts and they nationalized, we had an oil company operating there, they just nationalized them and didn't give them any compensation. And the court said, yeah, that's fine. Well, Thailand wouldn't get any more foreign investment. Okay, so Thailand's not likely to do that. Okay, and furthermore, what Exxon and these other companies could do where they do invest in a country where they don't trust their legal system, you get insurance. Okay, so why do we have to set up this whole new apparatus to deal with this small number of cases where you have companies investing in countries with questionable legal systems? Okay, anyhow, so long and short, I'm just saying that aspect of it I'm not upset about. The last point, I already said a little bit about patents and copyrights, but I will just say something that happened just a couple days ago and got very little attention here. China just announced that it has a major new initiative in producing generic drugs. Now you might ask me, what on earth does that have to do with anything? Well, possibly nothing. But the other thing that's possible, where you have a patent, where you have generic is not well defined, particularly in developing countries. So India, for example, it's much harder to get a patent in India than it is in the United States. So there's a lot of things that are patentable in the United States that aren't patentable in India. So some of our drugs, say Sovaldi, this big hepatitis C drug that sells for $80,000 a treatment, that can't get a patent in India. Okay, I won't go into the details on that. Now, if China were to say, okay, we're going to really push our generic drug industry, we're going to be very tight on giving patents, and we're not just going to have it domestically, 1.3 million people, 1.3 billion people in your domestic market, but we're also going to export it, that could really be a very, very big hit to Pfizer and Merck and our other drug companies. Now, I don't know that that's what China's thinking, but they did make a point of announcing this just 2 days ago. So whether that was a shot over the bow to say, hey, we don't have to honor your copyrights, your patents, or whether it was just something they had in the works that just happened to come out 2 days ago, I don't know. But I just mentioned that. Something worth watching. Okay, the Affordable Care Act. This has become, the Affordable Care Act, the Republicans opposed it from day one. I mean, I'm not putting words in anyone's mouth. They were quite open. They didn't like it, government intervention, whatever. Only one Republican voted for it between the House and Senate, and that was after it had already been approved. So there was one member of the House, one Republican member of the House, that after they had the vote and it was clear they had a majority, he turned around and voted yes on it. So you had one of all the Republicans in the House and Senate. So they've made it clear, repeal Obamacare. Once they took control of the House, they voted I don't know how many times to repeal. I mean, they know it was going nowhere as long as Obama was in the White House. But in any case, they've made this, we're going to get rid of it. And Trump, of course, said this during the campaign. Okay, so what are the major provisions of Obamacare? Well, one was to prohibit discrimination based on health. And this is a huge, huge issue. Because prior to Obamacare, you have people that have a pre-existing condition. So someone had a heart condition, a cancer survivor. If they want to get insurance, well, in many states they simply couldn't get it. Insurers could just say, we don't want anything to do with you. Or alternatively, they could say, okay, we'll insure you, but we're going to charge you $50,000 a year. Okay, so that was totally legal, at least in most states. Some states did prohibit that. Most states it was totally legal. And what that meant was if you had serious health issues, you couldn't get insurance, or you at least couldn't get affordable insurance. Flip side of that, they said mandate coverage. The logic of that is that when you do that, you make insurance more expensive because you do have expensive people getting insurance. And what that means, I'm a healthy person, so I'm going to say, oh, I'd rather not pay insurance, I'll take my chances. Well, what they said was that we're going to mandate everyone gets insurance. So that's, in effect, a way of making healthy people share in the cost. Okay, you could argue whether it's good or bad, but that was the point of it. Provide subsidies. Well, a lot of people can't afford their insurance. So you have subsidies. Someone who's earning $30,000 a year, they can't afford a $3,000, $4,000 policy, so provide subsidies. Arguably not generous enough, but in any case, that was part of it. And the last part was they extended Medicaid coverage. Now, the court ruled that they couldn't force states to extend Medicaid coverage, so I think there are 12 states. I'm forgetting the exact number. There are 12 states, we'll say 12, but a number of states, all Republican states, states controlled by Republicans, have decided not to extend Medicaid coverage. Okay, so what Trump tried to do was pass a repeal of this, and they came one vote short. Some of you may have caught this. John McCain, of course, now has cancer. He came back from Arizona. He was being treated, came back, and they're waiting for, they're counting down the votes, the time on the votes, and he came into the Senate, and he goes, nope, and that meant they were one vote short. So they haven't been able to repeal it so far. What they've done, though, is they've radically changed the enforcement. So the discrimination based on health, they're allowing that. Okay, not with all policies, but basically it's going state by state. So you've had a number of states that there's always this provision. You can have short-term policies, which I think were limited to 3 months. They said they could be a year, and on those states could do pretty much whatever they want. So I could get a short-term policy where, being in good health, I could get it for, let's say, $1,000. On the other hand, they tell me, oh, if you had cancer, you're going to have to pay $50,000. So they're basically unregulated. Okay, so they've weakened that hugely. The mandate, the mandate for coverage, I actually thought they weren't enforcing that, and I foolishly didn't put my proof of coverage with my taxes, so they waited to send me my refund. They are still enforcing that, so if any of you wondering, it's not April 15th yet. They are still enforcing that. I thought they weren't. But as of next year, they're not going to enforce that. Okay, so beginning, and that was passed by Congress, so that's law, so that wasn't just administrative action. The subsidies, those are still in place, and they're fairly generous at the low end. Now, I won't go into details. They've played around with this some, but basically the subsidies are still very much in place. They would have to pass a law, a new law, to take away the subsidies. And the extension of Medicaid, that is still in place. And again, there are efforts to weaken that. You have Kentucky, I believe, several states, but I think Kentucky's in the lead, that's now imposing a work requirement for people to get Medicaid. Okay, so it's still there, but they're making it more punitive, obviously less attractive if there's a work requirement associated with it. Also, I should point out, I mean, a lot of the people who are getting Medicaid are low income, and the reason why they're not working is because they're in bad health. So it's, you know, whatever. That's the policy. Okay. Business-friendly financial business-friendly regulation. They've made a really big focus on financial regulation. So, of course, you get the Dodd-Frank Financial Reform Act passed in 2010 in the wake of the financial crisis. So the logic was, you know, how can we prevent something like that from happening again? So the idea was, you know, not necessarily to restore the regulations that existed, you know, back from post-Depression era, but at least tighten up on many of the abuses that we saw during the build-up to the financial crisis. So one of the things they did was they created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. This is kind of a, well, I'll back up a little on this. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was in large part about preventing companies, financial companies, from ripping off clients. And the logic here is you had a lot of people making commitments on loans. They didn't know what they were getting into. And the big story with the financial crisis, the housing bubble, you had a lot of people get adjustable rate mortgages that didn't fully appreciate what was going on with them. So it was very common for banks to issue mortgages. They were called 228s, that for 2 years they had a low teaser rate. And then they would jump after those 2 years. Okay, so it was common, someone might take out a mortgage that maybe they paid 3-4% interest the first 2 years, and then it would jump to 7 or 8% after 2 years. So they could afford the 3 or 4% interest, but suddenly when they're looking at 7 or 8%, they couldn't afford that. So that was part of the story. I'm not going to say it's by any means the whole story, but that was part of the story of how you had the collapse of the housing bubble. You had a lot of people that were able to buy homes that they couldn't otherwise afford because they're getting a mortgage of 3%. Well, suddenly the mortgage is 7%, they can't afford that. All right, you had a lot of things like that. I mean, that's you know, probably the biggest, most important example. But the logic of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was to try to police the industry so that you're not issuing mortgages like that. Now, what Trump did was they couldn't just repeal that. I mean, they could in principle if they got through Congress, but they can't. But what he did was he appointed his own person, Mick Mulvaney, as the acting director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Now, I'll try to restrain myself here, but this is kind of outrageous, not because whether I like or dislike Mick Mulvaney, but the point is he's the acting director. Anyone know why that matters that he's acting director? Not official, and yeah. Doesn't go through Congress. That's right. So if he wanted to, he could say, I want Mick Mulvaney to be the director. Okay, submits it to the Senate. Senate looks him over. Republican Senate, they might approve him. I don't know. You know, but they would look over, you know, what are his credentials? What are his potential conflicts of interest? You know, they would review that. The other thing about something about the director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, he's not a cabinet member. Okay, if he's unhappy with, you know, his defense secretary, he could fire him any day of the week, you know, and he might well do that. You know, he's fired a number of his cabinet members. He cannot fire the director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, except for cause. I mean, if he finds out the guy's been, you know, putting a budget into his pocket, then he goes, hey, he's been putting the budget in his pocket, you're fired. But he can't fire him because I don't like what he just did. He can't fire him for that. Acting director, he could fire any day of the week. And guess what? Mick Mulvaney is also head of Office of Management and Budget, so he has a day job. So he could, in fact, fire him from 2 jobs any day of the week. Okay, that's not the independence that was designed in the law. Okay, now Mulvaney's basically said he's cut back. They've had a whole range of enforcement measures. People had gone to court, they'd investigated cases. In one case, they actually had agreed with the settlement with the, I forget, it was a payday lending company. And he just said, no, we're going to drop the case. So Mulvaney, I should point out, when Mulvaney is a former member of Congress, he said it was a joke. So that's who he's appointed there. Now this is, there's two sides to this that, on the one hand, you could say, okay, we feel bad for people being ripped off. But the other part, from as an economist, we care about efficiency. Well, what does it mean if I tell financial companies, hey, you can make a lot of money if you can find ways to rip off people? They're going to find ways to rip off people, right? I mean, you make a lot of money. And, look, they're smart people. It's not to say their customers are stupid, but, I don't spend my life reading financial documents, contracts. So you give me, how many you signed, your privacy thing with Facebook? Do you know what it said? The idea we have government regulations like this because we don't want everyone to have to spend hours and hours and hours reading this contract. Oh, I want to take out a car loan. Well, here's pages of it. What does it say? Well, the idea is the government's going to allow certain types of contracts. They put there that if you fall a month behind, they get to take your kid. That's not enforceable, because we don't want them doing things like that. Well, if, you tell them they could rip off their clients, a lot of them are going to do that. Okay, fiduciary rule, again, it's the same sort of thing. This was something that the Labor Department had put in place under Obama that they were suspending. Fiduciary rule says that if I have a financial advisor, they have to act in my interest. Okay, so they have to, in effect, be telling me, hey, if say I have a 401k and I go to a financial advisor, they can't just say, hey, why don't you put that into, this fund over here that gives me a kickback of, 0.5% of what you put in. Because a lot of them do that. Okay, it says I have to act in the interest of my client. Doesn't mean I may still give them bad advice. It may turn out that, I tell them it would be a really good thing to put all their money in the stock market and the stock market plummets. They could do that. But the point is I'm trying to act in their interest. I'm not telling them to put the money in a fund where they give me a big kickback. Well, that was pushed through in the Obama administration by the Labor Department. They've suspended that. So it's what ultimately happens with that remains to be seen. Environmental regulation. This is an ongoing story. The Trump administration is basically doing everything it can to reverse whatever the Obama administration put in by way of trying to restrict greenhouse gas emissions. Right now, the latest thing is they're rolling back the standards, the mileage standards that the Obama administration put in. And they're looking, I don't know exactly where this stands legally, but they're looking to take away California the right to put in its own regulations. The reason for that was they had a particularly bad smog problem. That's been the historic reason for that. They're looking to take that away. They'd had stronger regulations. The last thing, they're opening up large amounts of public land to mining and drilling. Okay? And again, you could argue good thing or bad thing, but I'll just say there's way more land for mining and drilling than the oil companies, the other companies know what to do with today. So, basically what this does is put a lot of environmentally sensitive land at risk. So I think that's yes. So just to conclude, I realize I've gone a little longer than I should have. What I would just say in general, that you have a lot of policies that I think are going to be effective redistributing more income upward. And given that we've had 4 decades of serious upward redistribution, that's probably not the best way to be going right now. So I'll stop with that. I don't know if we have time for questions. I'm always hesitant to try and speculate about how he thinks, but what he seems to be approaching at, our trade policy, not just our trade policy, world trade policy has been designed to lock in rules so that, you understand what you do, what you can't do. If you do X and you aren't supposed to do it, you'll pay a penalty for it. He seems to want to have it so that he could penalize anyone anytime he wants for doing things he doesn't like. And that is a really, really bad policy. Now, that may have been the way he did business as a real estate person. But as government policy, that is, because people get, I can't do business with you because, you're going to come back tomorrow and say you didn't like the deal we signed yesterday, and that means it's worthless. Why should I ever do a deal with you? So it's really bad from a policy standpoint, but that seems to be the way he's going. Well, the tariffs, first off, China doesn't have, we haven't hurt China. It's like, you go up to, some big football player and you kick him in the knee, Okay, what do you do that for? So no, we didn't force China to the negotiating table. Will they want to negotiate? They might. It really depends. And again, I don't have access to what he might be saying privately, but what he's saying publicly doesn't really make any sense to me. Okay, you have a big trade surplus with us. Okay, what do you want us to do? So, I forget whether I mentioned this earlier, but China has deliberately kept their currency down. So he could raise that quite legitimately, but he hasn't said that. In fact, during his campaign, he repeatedly yelled about China currency. And then he met with President Xi from China back, I think it was last March, and he was asked, and he goes, why would I raise currency with him? We had a real good conversation. He was going to help us with North Korea. That's fine, but then don't come back and say you had the opportunity. I mean, you could raise it again, but what's he trying to do? I don't know. So if he has clear demands with China that they think are reasonable, sure, they'll negotiate with him. But to my view, what he's put on the table, there's nothing reasonable there. So I don't know what, and they don't have to negotiate. They could just go, fine. You'll put those tariffs on, we'll put some tariffs on. You want to put more on, we'll put some more on. It's not going to hurt us. I mean, there'll be some pain. But again, you kick the guy, and rather you didn't do it. But it's not, he's going to walk away from it. And they would walk away from this. So I don't really understand what he's doing there. Now, in terms of the economy, we had an economy that was growing the whole time under Obama. The stock market actually grew more rapidly under Obama. I don't think the stock market's a good measure of the economy, but if you want that, it grew more rapidly under Obama, but I don't think that's a good measure. There has been some uptick. I mean, basically the story is the unemployment rate, the economy's crashing when Obama comes in. I'm not making apologies for the guy. I mean, you can look at the data. We're losing 700,000 jobs a month. So he passes the stimulus, does some other measures, the economy stops crashing, turns around, it's growing again by the end of 2009. Okay, would that have happened anyhow? Well, the economy wasn't going to crash forever, but I think the stimulus definitely had a positive impact. Okay, it's been growing ever since, roughly 2% a year, sometimes a little better. We had some good quarters, sometimes over 3% under Obama too. But what happens is we're getting close, and we could argue, we would argue over how low the unemployment rate could go. But we are getting to a point where the unemployment rate's, I'll just say, near full employment in the sense that it can't go too much lower. So in other words, we're at 4.1. How low do I think it could go? I think we can certainly get to 3.5, maybe 3. I hope so. But a lot of economists would have a real big argument. In fact, I argued with a lot of economists that we couldn't even get to 4.1. So this has been part of a long process. Now, has Trump influenced that? With the tax cut, I think we're putting more money into the economy. That probably has some positive short-term influence. So in that sense, that probably does increase the growth rate some, just as any increase in deficit would likely increase the growth rate some. Now, in terms of picking on him about the investment, that's a very, very specific thing that, again, this is, if I had Kevin Hassett here, who is his chief economist, he said, it was going to increase investment. And, Kevin's a smart guy, so he might have some reasons to why we don't see any evidence. But again, I'm looking at the orders. So his work suggests that you would have something like a 30% increase in investment. So I'm saying, okay, we should see something by way of orders, because again, we're assuming business people are smart. They saw this was being debated back in September. I mean, they put it on the table. So, Google and GM and all the other businesses, they know what's going on in Washington. So it's a little hard to believe that if this is going to have a big impact on their investment, that none of them said, hey, what do we want to do? If we're looking at 21% tax rate rather than 35, what do we want to do? So I think that's a fair thing to look at. Again, maybe we will see this later in the year, but you would expect if it's going to have anything like the impact that they were claiming to see something by now.